I learned what betrayal feels like the night a key I never issued scraped at my front door, and a voice on the phone insisted a stranger already spoke for me. The plan wasn't love, it was leverage, pressure, dressed up as concern, urgent timelines, and a future I was expected to fund by surrendering the present. Paperwork became armor, boundaries a lifeline. When the mask slipped, the wound wasn't just financial, it was the kind that tells you your trust has been taken for granted and your dignity marked as negotiable. I stood in my own hallway, listening to the lock deny entry, and finally understood the lesson no one teaches you young. Care without limits becomes control. You're choosing a house over family, they said. No, I was choosing law over leverage, so love could have room to breathe. Before we dive into today's story, let us know where you're watching from. And as you watch, don't just sit back, be part of the experience. If a moment grabs your attention, whether it's powerful, unexpected, or deeply moving, drop a comment with the timestamp of that scene and share your thoughts. Your reactions bring the story to life, and we love seeing which moments resonate with you the most. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now grab a coffee or tea, settle in, and let's begin. I turned 62 on a Tuesday that smelled like the Sound, salt on cool air, gulls heckling the quiet, and for the first time in 3 years I felt steady enough to buy a house without asking anyone's blessing. Tacoma had a way of settling my pulse. The water worked like a metronome below the bluffs, and the long boardwalk at Old Town Dock gave my cardiologist's pacing app something to cheer about. I walked there most mornings, counting pilings and breath, telling myself that routine was a bridge plank and I could lay one plank after another until I reached something like peace. The Craftsman sat a few blocks up from the bay, a broad-shouldered house from the early 1900s with a porch that asked for wicker and late light. Its bones were honest, beadboard ceilings, thick fir floors, a staircase that didn't groan. I bought it through an LLC my attorney drew up, Reed Harbor LLC, because engineers prefer redundancy to romance. Liability shield, privacy, clean books, not paranoia, just good process. The price tag was a neat round $1 million paid from the life insurance my wife left and the proceeds from the small infrastructure firm we sold after her diagnosis. Money is only numbers until it isn't. Then it's risk and margin and the choice to breathe easier when the fog rolls in. Renovation made a pleasing kind of noise. The electrician's staplers clicking along joists, the low murmur of a GC who'd done a dozen seismic retrofits on this street, the thud of new door hardware finding its seat. We gutted the kitchen and started over, white cabinets with walnut counters warm as fresh bread, a gas range that could keep up with Thanksgiving, a farm sink that made even rinsing apples feel intentional. In the garage, I sanded an old kayak I dragged from our storage unit, measuring my strokes like prayer. The scent of cut pine and boiled linseed oil hung in the air long after the crews packed up. I didn't tell my son, not yet. Daniel lived in Seattle, sweating through a logistics startup that always seemed to be 2 months from greatness and 2 weeks from running out of runway. He meant well in the elastic way busy people do. He promised Sunday dinners that got pushed to after the round and texts that ran out of charge by midweek. I told myself the drive up I-5 was a courtesy buffer, proximity without pressure, as close as a father could be without becoming a task. If I could anchor here, maybe he'd have a place to land when the city felt too loud. Alyssa, his wife, had a talent for polish. She used to broker interiors for developers and still spoke about houses as if they were living things that needed good press. She called me meticulous like a compliment, and every third conversation came with the phrase, "optimize taxes." Once while we were clearing out my old file cabinet, she held up my will and said, "You know, early transfer can be very smart for families." I nodded and changed the subject to weather. There's a difference between being cautious and being rude. I kept one and refused the other. Secrecy felt less like a scheme than a courtesy. I wanted to finish the thing I was building before presenting it as a gift. A real kitchen, a safe staircase, a porch with string lights already hung. I could picture Thanksgiving, Daniel carrying a bronzed bird, Alyssa bossing the sides into order, me carving at the head of a table that faced the water. If that picture sounds sentimental, I'll say only that grief rearranges a man's appetite. The absence beside you at night becomes the shape of what you plan in daylight, and I had been hungry for something solid. I kept my circle small: the attorney, the general contractor, the property manager who coordinated permits and deliveries. We replaced the wiring, sistered weak joists, tied the frame to the foundation with hardware I could name by brand and sheer value. When the GC signed off on the seismic work, I slept through a windstorm for the first time since the hospital, the rafters quiet as a held breath. In the mornings, I made coffee and drank it on the steps while the ferry carved a white line across the bay. Neighbors waved with that measured Pacific Northwest friendliness, polite first, warm later, and I felt myself beginning to belong. The house gathered small emblems of readiness. A brass doorbell plate lay wrapped in tissue on the counter, waiting for the last coat of paint to cure. A coil of porch light cable leaned against the wall like a promise. Next to it, a box of smart locks sat unopened. I intended to install them once the painters stopped opening doors every 12 minutes. There's no sense in setting passwords before a project stops bleeding tradesmen. I made a note to call the locksmith anyway, belt and suspenders. Process doesn't make you invincible, but it makes you less easy to push. Money remained a ledger I read nightly. The numbers were not infinite, and I did not want to be the kind of father who substituted checks for conversation. Still, I allowed myself a few indulgences that were really safeguards. Upgraded breakers, exterior cameras angled to admire the porch instead of policing it, a modest service contract in case something electrical decided to cook on the 4th of July. When you've watched a body falter, you become attentive to systems. Houses are bodies too, and this one would hold. I phoned Daniel on Saturdays, kept the talk light. He mentioned meetings with a venture firm and a warehouse pilot that sounded like it had more acronym than oxygen. "We'll come down more often," he said, and I said I'd keep the freezer stocked. Alyssa texted links to houses she thought were good comps and asked whether I'd considered moving closer to the city core. I sent back photos of gulls and the ferry. She replied with a laughing emoji I pretended not to understand. Evenings were the best. The porch string lights warmed the last of the sun, and I'd oil the kayak rails until my hands smelled like a woodshop. From the kitchen window, I could see the bay turning slate, the far shore blinking its scattered lights. I would lay out the operating agreement for the LLC and read it the way some men read devotionals, line by line, finding assurance in clauses and contingencies. The documents were ballast. If I got the setup right, the rest could be human and complicated and forgiven. Once, setting the smart lock box aside, I felt a flicker of something, unease maybe, or simply the memory of the hospital beeps, and I let it pass. I told myself the secret was kind, not cruel, a way to offer something finished instead of yet another plan. I meant to install those locks the next day. The painters were almost done, the electrician had a punch list the length of a receipt, and the porch swing would be hung by Friday. In the quiet between crews, the house felt like a chest rising and falling. I breathed with it and believed for the moment that I was building a harbor and not a temptation. Daniel called on a gray Tuesday when the bay looked like brushed steel. He said they were surveying Tacoma and mentioned Alyssa's parents might move in for a while. The words were practical enough, but they landed with a small weight. I kept my voice even, and after we hung up, watched the water flatten under a shift of wind. Alyssa followed with links, a run of Craftsman thumbnails. One stopped me. The porch had the same squared columns and crooked brick path, and the copy talked about period details and a cash-preferred situation due to trust. The photos were old, yellowed cabinets, a scuffed rail I'd already sanded smooth. I recognized the angles without admitting anything to anyone. By mid-afternoon, another text. She had arranged a private showing through industry contacts. I answered that I might be in the neighborhood. I took the long way home, parked 2 streets over, and slipped through the alley as if I were a maintenance man late for a checklist. The painters were on their punch list, blue tape like confetti on the trim. I left the smart lockbox unopened on the counter, no sense installing it while hands still came and went with ladders. From the back porch, half in shadow, I could see the front walk and most of the yard without being seen. Observation has saved more bridges than speeches. Context first, conclusions later. Alyssa arrived just as the light thinned toward evening, a second woman in tow. sharp haircut, tablet in hand. They paused at the curb to admire the facade, narrating as if the house were already theirs to explain. I caught enough shorthand to place their intentions. Sightlines, the friend said. Owner's suite, Alyssa answered. They measured the living room windows with a tape that snapped and hissed. The numbers they spoke were my numbers. I had held those lengths when I ordered shades. It is a peculiar thing to hear your measurements repeated by strangers. The feeling comes on like a draft under a door. Noticeable, not yet cause to fetch a sweater, but not nothing. On the porch, they parceled out rooms. Alyssa said almost cheerfully that the primary upstairs was perfect for us. And then, as if assigning a coat closet, added that the small room by the laundry on the first floor would work for me so we can keep an eye on him. The words didn't bruise so much as mark, like a ring left by a wet glass. At the door, Alyssa tried to wake the lock with a thin NFC card. The deadbolt blinked its red refusal. She frowned, bent close, and took tight photographs of the latch brand, the strike plate, the way the screws set. She sent the shots to someone with a summary brisk enough to be a purchase order. Her friend waited on the step, scrolling as if offers were weather. They traced out a nursery wall in the side yard and paced the grass, already editing a life I hadn't yet had the chance to live. Dusk laid a blue film over everything. I am not a man who looks for insult. I am a man who counts. And what I counted, more than their words, was the confidence with which they used them. They traced out a nursery wall in the side yard and paced the grass, already editing a life I hadn't yet had the chance to live. Dusk laid a blue film over everything. I am not a man who looks for insult. I am a man who counts. And what I counted, more than their words, was the confidence with which they used them. Through the sidelights, I tracked their movement by voice. Cash floated in more than once, and closing quickly. Another line penciled itself. Tom by the stairs. Hearing it mattered. Information is a temperature as much as a fact. The room felt a degree warmer than I liked. Confidence, misapplied, becomes assumption. Assumption, left alone, becomes policy. They drifted back to the curb. Alyssa called Daniel. I caught fragments the way you catch radio between stations. Primary is perfect. Measurements good. We can move fast. The house sat between us like the subject of a debate I hadn't agreed to join. My wife used to say storms announce themselves as a small pressure drop. I felt that drop. The painters coiled cords and peeled their tape. I went inside and closed the back door with careful hands. The smart lock box was where I'd left it. I rested my palm on the cardboard and considered installing them, declaring a perimeter and a policy. Instead, I set the box aside and filled the kettle. Signals are not yet evidence. A man who loves an engineer's certainty learns to wait until he can name what he's looking at without borrowing anyone else's language. By the time the kettle clicked, the street had gone quiet. The bay lost its silver and went to slate. From the porch, I watched the last dog walker pass and the first porch lights glow. I told myself I would keep watching. No drama, no speech until the facts arranged themselves. Then I turned off the lights and let the house breathe in the dark, preparing for weather I hoped would pass and knew might not. Daniel called before the sun had burned the gray off the bay, his voice pitched for urgency. He said there were other buyers circling, that if I would front an early inheritance, they could move fast. The phrasing was a compression tool, the way salesmen shrink time until prudence feels like betrayal. I set the LLC folder flat on the kitchen island, laid a pen across the hinge to steady my hands, and replied that speed without documents is drama, not diligence. I asked for the listing agent's name, a preliminary title report, and an escrow timeline with the usual contingencies. Silence stretched a beat too long. He said Alyssa already had rapport, that it would be smoother to let her handle it. Agent's name, title report, escrow timeline, or there is no money, I said, keeping my voice sanded smooth. We wished each other a good morning and hung up like men closing the lid on a box that would not hold. The house smelled like paint and walnut oil. I wiped the island, squared the smart lock box so its label faced the room, and told myself I would observe, not perform. If they had a showing, it would appear on the calendar. If they did not, what happened next would reveal itself without my help. Outside, Commencement Bay flashed a dull silver under a lid of cloud. The ferry horn sounded and rattled the glass like a knuckle on a door. They came mid-afternoon, right on cue with no cue at all. Alyssa stepped out first, all forward momentum and casual authority, her parents close behind and a young man in a work vest carrying a laser measure and clipboard. They moved through the yard like a team executing a plan already decided. Alyssa's tone was managerial, the kind you use when timelines are tight and the budget belongs to someone else. The parents wore the dazed hope of people who have been told life can be rearranged by enough square footage. Inside, I drifted to the hallway that runs behind the entry and watched their reflections in the sidelights. The laser man called out widths and sills and door setbacks. The figures matched the ones in my notebook. Alyssa narrated allocations in a bright voice that turned rooms into assignments. The primary upstairs would be perfect for us, she said. The small room near the laundry, barely more than a den, would be ideal for Tom so we can look in on him. It was not cruel. It was administrative. But the sentence placed me like an appliance, and something old and muscular in me did not take kindly to being plugged where convenient. They paused at the front door, and Alyssa photographed the hardware again, brand, model, the way the screws bit the plate, then put someone on speaker and read the details as if reciting a requisition. Her mother asked about the view. Her father stared at the stairs with a hand on his back. The laser man swung his device through the dining room and scribbled. In the side yard, they paced out a wall and called it a nursery. They spoke about closing quickly, cash preferred, trust complications. The cadence told on the plan: get in fast, define the spaces, reassign the person who paid for them. From the shadowed hall, I texted the manager. Is there a scheduled showing right now at my address? The reply came back in a minute, blunt and unadorned. No appointment on calendar. I took a screenshot. It is one thing to feel supplanted, it is another to be able to print it. The painters packed their brushes and the yard went quiet but for the gulls. I returned to the kitchen and dialed the bank's fraud line to tighten verification. A polite woman thanked me for my vigilance and, by way of reassurance, referenced a recent verification they had already completed. A family member, she said, had answered my passphrase and identified herself as holding my power of attorney, so they had flagged my accounts as monitored. My breath shortened, not from panic but from the sudden reappearance of hospital air. I said there is no power of attorney. Not one signed by me, not now or ever. I asked for the call log, the time and date, the rep ID, the number dialed. She read them off. I wrote everything down as if numbers might anchor the room. We set a new voice passphrase and a rule that no changes could be enacted without an in-branch visit and government ID. I asked them to place a fraud alert with the bureaus and to note on my file that no third party is authorized to speak for me. The rep sounded chastened and kind. I did not need her contrition. I needed a barricade that could not be moved by charm. When I hung up, I watched steam trail off the rim of my mug until it thinned to nothing. I thought about how quickly a story can flip from odd behavior to a procedural breach. There is a taxonomy to violation. First comes assumption, then access, then authorization. They had reached for the third without asking. My pulse found its metronome, the same slow count I learned in cardiac rehab, and the kitchen steadied around me. I cataloged the day. Daniel's compression pitch, my boundary, the manager's no appointment confirmation, the laser measure brigade, the bank's call log, and my new passphrase. I emailed the attorney again with bullet points and attachments, asked him to preserve any possible recording of the bank call, and to advise on next steps if access attempts continued. He replied that documentation is leverage and time is my friend if I can stomach it. I would. I did not go to the front door. I did not announce ownership. I did not accuse. Men who rush speeches end up negotiating with their own adrenaline. I chose something narrower and more enduring, the quiet accumulation of fact. When the house settled that night, it was not fear or anger that I felt, but a clean, cold line. There would be rules now, mine, and I would write them on paper that outlasted weather. I opened the smart lock box the way a surgeon opens a tray, one piece at a time and in a sequence that quiets the mind. Deadbolt, hub, batteries, tiny screws that like to roll toward floor vents. The morning had the thin brightness Tacoma gets after rain, and the bay threw back a pale light that made the counters look cleaner than they were. I labeled each door in the app with the plain names engineers prefer: front, back, garage, entry. Then I paired the doorbell camera, set motion zones to catch anyone stepping onto the porch or cutting across the side path, and turned on cloud storage. The test ping arrived, a small chime in the pocket, and the house felt, for the first time, as if it could speak for itself. Paper speaks too. I printed the manager's email confirming by appointment only status and slid it into the LLC folder behind the operating agreement. A note to myself on a sticky: facts before feelings. I have never known a feeling that could hold a door closed, but a log file can, and a policy certainly can. Near midnight, the camera chirped. The porch filled with a hooded shape. The figure tried the handle, moved to the side door, then stood at the garage with a remote held low like a secret. A small red LED pulsed. The door twitched, not up, not open, but enough to show intent. The lock log recorded 3 denied attempts, time-stamped to the minute. I watched the clip twice. The old habit kicked in: freeze frame, scan for telltales, inventory what the system saw and what it couldn't. The person kept their head turned away from the lens as if coached. The device signature wasn't mine. In the morning, I called the HOA office and asked a neutral question about temporary remotes for addresses under construction. The receptionist said the president could issue temporaries in special cases. She gave a name that shared Alyssa's last name. I thanked her and asked her to read the policy verbatim. She did. I wrote down every word, the timestamp, and her initials. Lines connect if you draw them carefully enough. I pulled up the HOA roster online. The president's bio mentioned a cousin who works in real estate and design in the city. It was the kind of community gloss that hides the weight underneath. I thought about the midnight LED, the way the door shuddered against a command, and felt something click into place that had nothing to do with hardware. I texted the property manager a still from the clip and asked if any appointment had been scheduled. She replied in seconds: "No appointment on calendar." She added, almost as an afterthought, that a temp worker had been suspended last week for helping family with access. Another loose board discovered by weight rather than by sight. I screenshotted both messages and saved them to a folder I named Evidence, then renamed to Documentation, because I have learned that labels also testify. At 8:40, a text from Melissa arrived with a tone of condolence. She said they had lost the house to another buyer and that it was too bad after all the excitement. The timestamp sat 40 minutes after the camera recorded someone trying my garage. I lined the 2 images on the screen, the lost the house message and the clip's time code, like exhibits no one had yet asked to see. Contradiction is a kind of proof. Daniel called before 10. He said Alyssa had driven by and it looked like the locks had changed, that maybe squatters had moved in or someone had vandalized the place. I let the silence count to 4 and then told him the locks had changed because I installed them. I told him it was my house and that all access was by appointment, only through the manager. The sentence had the feel of a new keel under an old boat. He exhaled into the phone as if someone had taken a weight from his chest and replaced it with a different weight. He asked careful whether I was serious about ownership. I said yes. I added, just as careful that there were cameras on the property for safety during construction and that they had recorded attempts to enter without authorization. I did not accuse, I did not describe the hooded jacket or the garage LED. I said only that any legitimate visit should be scheduled. He said he understood. We ended the call like 2 men setting tools down at the end of a shift. Afterward, I rotated lock codes, disabled auto unlock, and tightened the geofence so nothing opened unless I was standing on the porch with my phone in my hand. I set push alerts for any tamper events and tuned the sensitivity down 1 notch to avoid chasing shadows. Belt and suspenders. Then I emailed my attorney a summary with attachments: the clip, the lock log, the manager's no appointment reply, the HOA admission about temporary remotes, and a screenshot of Alyssa's lost the house text. We drafted a cease and desist template regarding unauthorized access and mended fences, and I placed a printed copy in the LLC folder where practical things sleep until they wake. It is a strange relief when a feeling gets promoted to a fact. My hands stopped their small tremor. The slow counting from cardiac rehab slipped back into my breathing and stayed. I made tea and watched the bay shift from pewter to bright aluminum under a noon sun. The house did its quiet work, sensors checking, locks confirming, logs appending in the background like a clerk who doesn't mind long hours. I called the HOA again and asked for an appointment to review gate device issuance for my address. The receptionist, more formal now, said the president would return my call. I wrote the line down without deciding yet what to do with it. There is a version of this story where I take the shortest road to anger, but those roads have potholes deep enough to break an axle. I would rather drive the long route on firm ground, with signs I can point to later. Evening came blue and honest. The new locks ticked through their self-check and reported green. I sat on the porch steps and listened to the ferry's horn stitch the far hills to the water. Courtesy had done its turn. Policy would take the night shift. Somewhere up the street, a wind chime sounded like cutlery being sorted. I didn't feel victorious. I felt properly aligned, spine over hips, house over foundation, facts over heat. If Chapter 3 taught me to gather, Chapter 4 taught me to fasten. Whatever came next would meet a surface that didn't give. I set the room as if preparing for a deposition rather than a family visit. 2 chairs faced the sofa with a low table between them, coasters centered, a glass of water for each of us. The doorbell camera was on, the living room camera set to record, and the blinds adjusted so daylight washed the room without glare. On the table, I placed a small stack. The manager's email confirming by appointment access only, a printout of last night's lock-denied log with timestamps, and a still frame from the doorbell video that showed a hooded shoulder and a gloved hand at my handle. No faces, no theatrics, just the facts arranged so they could breathe. Daniel arrived first, his eyes flicked to the new deadbolts the way a driver checks mirrors, automatic, worried. Alyssa came behind him with the posture of someone walking into a negotiation she expects to direct. She kept her phone face down on her palm like a talisman. I invited them to sit. The house held its breath the way old houses do when they know who pays the power bill. I began with the simplest truth because simple truths carry the farthest. It's my house, I said. Access is by appointment only. The property is monitored. The words were not a challenge. They were a boundary line, chalked clean. Alyssa's smile was service-trained. She said I had made things awkward by keeping secrets, that I had dangled the place to test them, that families help each other rather than hide assets behind companies and rules. She used the language of care to frame my caution as cruelty, and I recognized the move because I used to watch city attorneys reframe budget constraints as betrayals of vision. I did not argue her adjectives. I slid the paperwork forward with a fingertip. The doorbell still showed the exact minute someone tried my lock. The log recorded 3 denied entries across 12 minutes, each with a unique code signature. The manager's email said plainly that no showings were scheduled and none had been authorized. Daniel read each page twice and kept his eyes on the paper, because looking up would make the situation suddenly personally real. I named the conduct without raising my voice. My bank had informed me that a woman identifying as family had answered my passphrase and claimed to hold my power of attorney. There is no such document. I had requested the call log, changed my passphrase, and set in-branch only rules for any alterations. I had also spoken with the HOA. The president can issue temporary remotes in special cases, and the president's last name matches Alyssa's. I didn't say cousin because I didn't need to. I let the chain of events sit there, cool on the table, and I watched to see which part landed. Alyssa kept her eyes on me, not the papers. She said efficiency is not a crime, that everyone wins if I transfer the title now, that estate taxes punish families that plan late, that she knows people who can make the process frictionless. The veneer of concern thinned. What showed through was the playbook. Create urgency, declare mutual benefit, shame process is paranoia. I answered as an engineer, not a scold. Intent does not legalize method. Family is not authorization, I said. Systems exist because trust occasionally fails and good people do foolish things to save face. The bank breach was a method. The night attempt was a method. Obtaining a garage remote through a relative with gatekeeper powers was a method. Methods announce themselves. I was listening. Daniel asked if I was certain about ownership and whether the appointment rule was really necessary. I handed him the manager's email, the LLC letterhead, the time-stamped clip. He nodded, a movement so small it looked like breath. He said they just wanted to see the place together, to imagine where a crib might go, to plan. His voice made it a request instead of a pressure tactic for the first time in weeks, and for a second I remembered him at 12 with a soccer ball, glancing at me to see if his idea was allowed. "We can tour," I said. "We'll schedule it through the manager." I kept my eyes on Daniel and let the offer hang there as a bridge. Alyssa's mouth tightened. She asked whether I intended to lawyer up against my own family. I told her my attorney was already looped and that all future communication about property or money needed to be in writing. It was not a threat. It was a file structure. She called it controlling. I heard her say the word and imagined labeling a breaker in the panel box. Kitchen lights, living room, boundary. I told them I would also be notifying the HOA board about the temporary remote practice and asking for a written policy. If a community holds the keys, it must keep a ledger anyone can read. We ended cleanly. I summarized in a memo I had printed before they arrived: no keys or devices in circulation, no access without an appointment confirmed by the manager, no third-party calls on my behalf to banks or vendors, all property-related communication in writing. I slid a copy to each of them. Daniel folded his carefully like a map. Alyssa left hers on the table for a beat and then took it with 2 fingers as if it might smudge. At the door, I walked them through what I would have walked anyone through: the porch light timer, the step that catches the toe if you're not watching, the view line that opens when the first trees shift after wind. Not to be gracious exactly, but because decency is my habit even when I'm done being easy. The locks engaged with a final click that sounded to me like a spine finding alignment. Twilight put a silver wash on the bay. I sat, emailed my attorney a brief summary with attachments, and drafted a short notice to the HOA requesting an agenda slot at the next board meeting to discuss device issuance and policy. The house calmed under the rhythm of small cooling noises. I poured water into the 2 untouched glasses and drank mine in 3 swallows. When I set it down, the table was still. Anger had taken its turn. Resolve would carry the weight now. Chapter 6 could come with whatever story it liked. My side had moved from courtesy to policy, from feeling to paper, and paper has a way of holding. Chapter 6. Climax. The choice I would not borrow. I began the morning the way I begin all consequential days, with paper. I opened the timeline journal and logged yesterday's meeting, time, attendees, the stack of exhibits I'd laid on the table, the sentences I'd chosen because they were solid and short. I scanned the memo of rules I'd handed them and attached it to a calm recap email addressed to both of them: ownership, by appointment access, cameras in operation, all communications in writing. I kept adjectives out of it. Adjectives are for feelings, the inbox is for facts. By late morning, the bay had turned the color of brushed nickel and the house held the cool of night under its eaves. A knock came, not hurried, not shy. Alyssa stood alone on the porch, paler than I'd seen her, a sweater pulled too tight as if she were bracing against wind that wasn't there. She said 2 words chosen for their lever: "I'm pregnant." Then the frame around them: stress is dangerous. Housing instability is a risk. We should solve this compassionately. I led her into the dining room and slid my phone to the table face up with the voice recorder open. I set the memo of rules between us as if it were a placemat. We can talk, on the record. She nodded and took a breath the way people do when they've rehearsed a scene and reached the first difficult line. From her bag, she produced a silver USB drive and placed it carefully on the wood. She said it contained a draft thread showing that I had intended to transfer the house for tax efficiency. A simple consent that would save the family trouble later. She said the words a consultant says when the invoice requires everyone to move briskly. I powered down Wi-Fi, plugged the USB into the side of the laptop, and opened only a safe viewer. A PDF blinked onto the screen, an email chain with my name at the top, a generic tax counsel in the headers, and a paragraph consenting to an early transfer this quarter. I did not read the sentences first. I opened the file properties and looked for the seams, the places a hurried hand leaves fingerprints. The author field held a username I didn't recognize. The creation timestamp sat inside a window. My calendar insisted I had spent horizontal and sedated for a cardiology procedure. The mail client string wasn't one I use. The time zone offset was wrong for Tacoma at that hour. I took photos of the metadata pane and the system clock with my phone, my hand as steady as if it were holding a level against a stud. I read the body then because due process has a sequence. The diction sounded like me the way a neighborhood copy shop can sound like a printer. Close enough if you don't look at the kerning. The template tried to be brisk and paternal. I closed the viewer and ejected the drive. The metadata doesn't line up, I said. Forging consent is fraud. She did not flinch at the word. She said it was just a template, a starting point, something I had said we should consider after the will discussion months back. She said everyone would benefit, that taxes punish families who delay, that she had spoken to people who could file everything cleanly in an afternoon. When persuasion meets an immovable object, it often grows more ornate. I did not decorate my answer. Pregnancy is not a permit to violate process, I said. I told her I would support them within clean lines, a prenatal stipend routed through documented channels if a doctor confirmed the pregnancy, a financial counseling package for Daniel, no transfers of title, no powers of attorney, no access outside of appointments. I slid the memo back to the center of the table with 2 fingers, a diagram of the fence. I sealed the USB in an envelope, wrote the date and time, and had her watch while I labeled it with the words she had used when she handed it to me. I photographed the envelope beside my watch face and the journal page, then sent my attorney a summary from my phone with the photos attached. I asked for a litigation hold on the bank's recording of the impersonation call and on the HOA's device logs. I asked for a referral to a digital forensics examiner. I CC'd myself and blind CC'd a secure archive because duplication is how you respect future you. She stood. Her voice went flat. You're choosing a house over family. I let the sentence sit until it cooled. I'm choosing law over leverage, I said. The distinction matters, and I wanted it on the tape. Keeping assets safe is how I remain useful as a father and, if the world is kind, as a grandfather. Breaking the systems that hold us upright in the name of love leaves everyone on the floor. After she left, I opened the window and let cold air take the room's heat. Then I called my attorney. We drafted a formal notice warning against further fabrication, impersonation, or unauthorized access. He gave me a name for forensics. I filed the envelope in the small fireproof box with our passports and a copy of the trust, and mounted a read-only disk image of the USB to a separate drive. I logged each action in the journal. Rituals tame adrenaline. Engineers use checklists for planes and scaffolds. This was only a house, but the ground felt higher where the list touched it. I wrote to Daniel separately, as a father, in sentences that asked nothing of him but clarity. I said I would pay for a financial counselor and, if a doctor confirmed a pregnancy, a modest prenatal stipend. I said both offers depended on budgets in writing and on no-contact attempts at the house. I told him I wanted him to become the man who could carry a crib upstairs without expecting someone else to hold the stairs steady. The room slowed. I ran the breathing sequence the rehab nurse had taught me, in for 4, hold for 4, out for 6, twice through the alphabet silently. The tremor that had lived under my right thumb since the hospital receded. Outside, a gull mapped the same lazy circle it had drawn 100 times over this block. The kayaks down at the dock clicked against their racks. Somewhere a wind chime sorted its bright metal into notes and then into order. At dusk, I took the porch steps 2 at a time and sat where the string lights hold the last of the day. The locks did their soft check and reported green. The bay shifted from pewter to ink. I said it aloud once to put it in the world where I could not weasel it back into comfort later. I won't buy peace with a signature I'll regret. The sentence wasn't a victory anthem. It was a keel. The night pressed in, the house breathed, and I let the choice settle to the bottom where it could hold. Fallout doesn't arrive like a wave. It comes as weather. Pressure dropping, grit in the air, a sky that can't decide. The first sign met me on the HOA message board, a thread about construction concerns and after-hours activity with my address implied but never named. I didn't bite. I forwarded the property manager's email by appointment only, no showing scheduled, to her and asked her to archive it with the project file. I did not reply to the thread. Spectacle eats facts for breakfast. An unsigned note appeared in my mailbox that afternoon, printed in a font meant to look like handwriting. It accused me of keeping family out, as if homes were community centers and boundaries a kind of sin. I slipped it into the documentation folder, stamped the date, and emailed my attorney. He recommended no response and reminded me that silence is often the best record. I took a long breath, the kind the rehab nurse called a reset, and let the insult pass through without taking root. Screenshots arrived from the neighbor across the street. She is one of those quiet angels communities run on. Alyssa had posted a gauzy photo of a nursery mood board overlaid with a paragraph about a controlling father keeping his future grandchild from a safe home. Names were omitted, details vague, but anyone with eyes could draw lines. I saved the images, tagged them by source, and filed them with the note. Defamation often prefers implication to assertion. My lawyer would sort the difference if we ever had to. Armor is built, not wished. I sat at the kitchen desk with a cup of coffee and walked through every layer. The 3 credit bureaus, freezes renewed, alerts confirmed, the banks, voice passphrase changed, a branch-only flag added, a code word for teller interactions that would mean nothing to anyone but me. The mobile carrier, account lock on, port out, pin set. The old landline number, once used by vendors, occasionally answered by my wife, was removed from every profile that still carried it like a ghost. By noon, the paper perimeter matched the physical one. The house earned attention, too. I rotated lock codes, shortened the auto-lock interval, and adjusted the camera retention length to 30 days with redundant cloud copies. A small sensor went on the garage side door, the kind that doesn't announce itself with blinking vanity. Inside the sidelight, I placed a discreet card, by appointment only, property under monitored renovation. It was not addressed to any person, and it felt less like a warning than a reminder that doors are not debates. My attorney tailored a cease and desist template to cover trespass, impersonation, and defamation by implication, sharp where it needed to be and cool everywhere else. We agreed to hold it unless another attempt hit the logs. I signed nothing yet. Restraint is not weakness. It is a decision to burn clean when you finally strike a match. Life insisted on staying ordinary in spite of everything. The widow across the street invited me for stew on Wednesday, and I accepted. On Thursday, I helped the young couple at the corner lift a crib from their SUV and up to the second floor while the father apologized for the narrow stair. It felt like an antidote to the mailbox note. The porch returned to being a piece of a system, air in and air out, favors sent and favors received without a ledger. Near dusk on Friday, Daniel arrived on foot. He looked thinner and older than his age, the way men do when a plan is cracked and their last decent night's sleep is several weeks behind them. He stood on the sidewalk a breath longer than a casual visitor would, and then stepped onto the porch as if the boards might have changed since he was a boy. He spoke without preamble, voice sanded down to its grain. We thought we could use the house as a backstop. I let the sentence land. I told him I appreciated truth late more than a lie early, and I restated the boundary with the gentleness you use when you're explaining weather, not fault. The house is not collateral. I could see the admission unspool behind his eyes, the bridge round that vanished, the payroll that landed like a stone, the idea that one signature could make the numbers stop shouting. I did not add weight to his shame. Humiliation doesn't teach, it just burns. I went inside and returned with the folder, the kind I used to hand new engineers on their first week. Inside sat a list of nonprofit financial counselors, a YMCA schedule for budgeting and debt classes, and a simple budget worksheet I'd printed on stiff paper because paper that feels like a plan is easier to write on. I told him I would sponsor both services if he committed in writing and stayed within the property boundaries we had set. I offered a small, time-limited stipend contingent on proof of attendance and a realistic reduction plan routed through a tracking account instead of cash so that both of us would be protected from our worst impulses. He nodded as if hearing a language he once spoke but had forgotten how to conjugate. We stood there a while, the two of us, the porch light warming its circle, the bay sending up its salt. He said he didn't know how to explain any of this to people who expected him to be a provider. I said there was a difference between providing and gambling in better clothes. He offered to show me projections. I said projections are for investors. I was offering an admission ticket to accountability. He laughed once, without humor, and agreed. We shook hands, and I watched him walk down the street lighter by half an ounce, which is sometimes all a man can manage on a Friday. After he left, I ran the breathing cadence again and found my pulse where I left it. I logged his visit, what he admitted, what I offered, and the conditions attached, then emailed the notes to myself and my attorney. The ritual restored my spine to its usual place. Outside, a child somewhere was laughing in that floaty way kids do when the evening is still young enough to ignore bedtimes. A neighbor dropped a loaf of fresh bread on my steps with a quick knock and no desire for thanks. I walked it across the street with a borrowed drill. It felt like a trade in a currency we rarely name but all understand. At 10, the HOA sent an agenda for next week's board meeting. Item 4 read like a hinge, access device issuance policy. I flagged the email, set a reminder, and stacked the evidence I planned to bring. Call notes, remote logs, the receptionist's verbatim policy quote. Private defense had been necessary. Now it would become public guardrails, built sturdy enough to outlast us. I rinsed my cup, locked the doors, and listened to the house exhale as if it, too, had been holding its breath. Paper first, then feelings. I spent the morning at the office nook, a sunlit bite cut from the kitchen, turning decisions into documents. My attorney and I revised the LLC's operating agreement to clarify manager succession and emergency authority, then stapled on an addendum to my revocable trust with no contest and undue influence language written as plainly as a road sign. We signed a living will and named my oldest friend as healthcare proxy. He knows how to tell a doctor no when no is the humane answer. The notary slid each sheet across the table with the same unhurried care a nurse uses with IV tubing. Originals went to the firebox, scans to an encrypted drive, and a second copy off-site. Backups are how you respect tomorrow. Banks and carriers got a second pass. I confirmed fraud alerts, re-verified the in-branch only flag, added a teller code word that would sound like nonsense to anyone but me, and requested printed confirmations for the file. My mobile carrier enabled account lock and a SIM swap PIN. The rep sounded almost grateful to walk through every step with someone who wasn't already on fire. It was boring work, which is how you know you're doing security correctly. I walked the perimeter with a clipboard the way I used to walk job sites. Front and back locks, code rotation complete, cameras, angles verified, retention set to 30 days with redundant cloud copies, garage side door. The discrete sensor chirped green and logged a heartbeat. Wi-Fi. Device inventory checked against MAC addresses I recognize. One orphaned guest credential retired with a satisfying click. Screenshots went into the security log. If it isn't written down, it isn't done. At the desk again, I drafted 2 boundary letters to Daniel. The stipend and counseling support I'd offered, now formalized. Attendance verified, budget submitted monthly. Payments routed through a tracked account, 0 house collateral, check-ins by email every Friday. To Alyssa, the same property rules and a clear sentence noting that any further impersonation or fabrication would trigger a formal response. The tone stayed cool and humane. I am not interested in punishment. I am interested in preventing repetition. By noon, I had RSVP Ed to the HOA manager and requested projector time. My agenda description fit on one line: access device issuance policy, proposal for verification and audit trail. I packed in evidence packet, timestamp stills from the doorbell clip, no faces, the lock denied log, the manager's no appointment email, the receptionist's verbatim note about president-issued temporaries, and the roster page that made the family tie clear without naming anyone not in the room. Guardrails, not grudges. The community room smelled like coffee and multi-purpose cleaner. 30 chairs faced a folding table with a humming projector. The board sat shoulder to shoulder. The president, Alyssa's cousin, watched the far wall with the attentiveness of a man reading the future. I kept my presentation to a single page on the screen and a few sheets in my hand. No drama, no narrative arc, just 3 phrases I trust. Process failure, control gap, corrective policy. I explained that devices had been issued without a ledger, that my lock logs recorded after-hours attempts, and that our current policy relied on memory and relationships. The retired IT auditor in the third row lifted a hand and said, "That's an audit trail problem, not a feelings problem." The room exhaled as if someone had finally named the weather. Questions did what questions should do. Widened the view. How many temporaries? No one knew. Who approves them? The president in special cases, the manager said, and the projector's light made the words look more official than they felt. A board member moved to suspend temporary issuance pending a new policy. The vote passed with hands up across the room. Then another motion, quieter, heavier, removed the president for conflict of interest and procedural abuse. The gavel fell after a count I could feel in my ribs. The cousin was out. We did not clap. We simply moved to the next item because neighborhoods survive on continuity as much as courage. A new policy took shape faster than I expected because once a vacuum is named, people will fill it with structure. Device issuance only through the management company. Photo ID and proof of need. Automatic logging of serial, time, and address. Quarterly audits and resident notification on every issuance. I volunteered a template spreadsheet and an afternoon to set it up. People nodded. Someone asked about training. The auditor offered to write a quick guide. We had a plan before the coffee cooled. In the hallway, a neighbor thanked me for fixing the gates without burning the neighborhood. I shook my head. We all fixed it. On the walk home, my heart stayed steady in that comfortable lane between idle and climb, which is how I know my body believed what my mind had decided. Back at the desk, I filed the vote, saved the PDF of the new policy, and sent the boundary letters with red receipts turned on. Daniel's email got one extra line at the top. Proud of your honesty. I'm in your corner, on paper. Alyssa's stayed strictly procedural. I closed the laptop and listened to the house make its small adjusting sounds as if wood and metal approve when people act like adults. Late afternoon blew in off the water with a clean edge. I brewed tea and stepped onto the porch. The locks clicked through a self-check and returned green. A ferry horn stitched one shore to the other in a long, low line. I felt an unfamiliar relief, the kind that arrives when a system and the truth point in the same direction. The documents in my hand were not trophies. They were tools. Love, at my age, wears a toolkit. Wills that spare guessing, proxies that spare panic, policies that spare neighbors from personality. I sat until the bay darkened to ink and the porch string lights took their shift. Tomorrow could bring noise. Tonight, the house was in order, and the order was not brittle. It had weight and give, like a good beam set where it belongs. I breathed until the breath did the breathing, and then I went inside, turned the deadbolt with a habit that now felt like gratitude, and let the quiet do its work. By the time the maples browned along the bluff and the ferry's horn sounded softer through early darkness, the house had acquired the scuffs that prove a place is loved. There's a crescent on the walnut counter where a neighbor set a casserole too hot and apologized as if she'd dented a cathedral. The porch swing, once stiff from new chain, creaks now in one good note. My steps have learned the places where the fir floors lift and settle, and my hands find the light switches without looking. The craftsman feels less like something I purchased and more like a body I inhabit, breathing with me, tiring with me, waking before I do. On the first Sunday of each month, I host a small table. The widow across the street brings salad with too much mint. The young couple from the corner arrive carrying bread their oven never quite browns, and the SUP instructor I met at the dock brings a bottle of something I can't pronounce and sips one glass all night. We talk about tides and shoulder aches and the grocery store that changes aisles without warning. No one sells anyone anything. We clear plates as a unit, and I send them away with leftovers in the plastic tubs my wife labeled years ago with a black marker that refuses to fade. Community, I've decided, is a kind of insurance you pay for with attention and errands. It does not solve anything, but it keeps you from solving alone. Sundays have another ritual now. Daniel calls at 5. We keep it simple. He reports counseling attendance with a screenshot of the check-in. I confirm the stipend transfer cleared to the tracked account and note any copay the account paid out. He tells me about a contract gig sorting warehouse inventory data and about a new habit of cooking rice and eggs when he would have ordered in. We don't talk about rounds or hustles or projected returns. Numbers are quieter when they belong to meals and medicine. I have learned to offer encouragement that does not sound like grading. Good work, I'll say, or that's a clean line. On Fridays, his budget lands in my inbox, a 2-page plan with amounts that make sense in the bone. I print it, mark only the questions, and file it beside the counseling receipts. The stipend has teeth. It pays a prenatal copay from the clinic we agreed on, never in cash, never on demand. When a receipt clears, I log it in documentation and feel the small relief that comes when a system behaves. Guardrails do something for the nervous system that pep talks cannot. They make room for breath. Alyssa stays in the frame but not in the foreground. Her texts are short and civil. Appointment confirmations for clinic visits Daniel attends, acknowledgments of Friday budget emails, a one-line note about vitamins. There are no access attempts and no commentary online. I look for the absence of heat and find it. That is enough for now. I learned in engineering that stability is often the victory no one claps for. Small repairs have taken on the size of prayers. I tuned the thermostat so the heat arrives 5 minutes before I step out of the shower. I lifted a sticking sash and planed the edge until the paint line turned to butter. I rewaxed the front door where the summer sun had raised a rash. The house responds to such attention the way bodies do. A little less groan on cold mornings, a little more patience in wind. On good afternoons, I walk down to Old Town Dock and watch the kayaks knock their racks like muted bells, then come home and cook clam chowder, the kitchen filling with the metallic scent of clams and the warmth of potatoes, softened just shy of falling apart. Once a month, Daniel and I meet at a coffee shop near the clinic. I keep the visit contained, 2 Americanos, 20 minutes. He looks brighter. Sometimes he shows me a photo of the ultrasound printout, a grainy moon with a caption from a tech who sees miracles all day and still writes, "Perfect little heartbeat." I nod and ask about the next appointment and whether the vitamins are sitting well. The conversation stays on rails. Affection, at this stage, is a timetable honored. Quarterly, the HOA sends the audit of access devices, serial numbers, dates, issuing authority, acknowledgments by resident. No anomalies. I save the PDF and feel a civic satisfaction that lands lower in the chest than pride. We removed a hinge and replaced it with a bracket. The gate swings true. It is not revenge, it is maintenance. One Sunday after we walked his numbers and he told me the new gig would extend to January if he kept his error rate down, Daniel went quiet. I heard the ferry and our shared breath, and then he asked the kind of question that hangs in a room for a lifetime. Would you consider being the guardian if something happens? He didn't rush it or dress it in strategy. He set the idea on the table and let it sit, a tool we might or might not pick up. I answered in the same grammar we've been speaking. I will, after a year of documented counseling and financial literacy. Then we signed conditions are not a wall, they are a bridge you count as you cross. He said he understood that he would talk to Alyssa. His voice carried honest discomfort instead of leverage. I prefer discomfort. It leaves both hands free. After dinner that night, I walked the block. The air had the clean edge that precedes frost. Porch lights made circles on sidewalks. A kid's scooter leaned against a hedge like a bookmark in a long chapter. People I now knew by first name waved without conversation. The sound lifted and fell, a slow lung. I did not feel watchful. I felt located. Back home, I filed the week's receipts, reconciled the stipend ledger, and ran the backup script that pushes encrypted copies to the drive in the firebox and to the cloud vault with the long password I put on a card in my wallet. The ritual no longer smelled like fear. It smelled like care. I closed the laptop and the house listened, the way wood listens when it registers that a day's work is over. On the porch, under the string lights, I sat until the bay turned from pewter to ink, and the fairy's last horn stitched the dark together. I tried to take the measure of this season and found it stubbornly ordinary in the best way. Dinners, budgets, stipends, receipts, phone calls that end on time, locks that click and report green. I have learned to treasure green. Love held inside boundaries becomes durable. It does not have to be loud to hold. The final lesson was forming itself in words I could hand to men my age without apology. I would sleep on it and say it plain tomorrow. Evenings come earlier now. From the porch I can watch the sound breathe in long measures. Dark water pulling and returning, a metronome set to human pace. The smart locks tick through their self-check, each one a soft throat clearing, and then the app on my phone gives the single color I trust. Green means the perimeter is set, the rules are holding, and I can put my attention elsewhere. I don't think of it as vigilance anymore. I think of it as the quiet stagehand that lets the play run without incident. Inside the firebox, the papers are warm from the house. The LLC operating agreement sits beside the trust addendum that spells out no contest and undue influence like street signs at a complicated intersection. The living will with my friend's name on the healthcare proxy line rides shotgun. At the bank and the mobile carrier, account locks and passphrases stand where a younger man once put his faith in charisma and handshakes. My cameras hum a light chorus, saving their small witness to the cloud without asking me to pay attention. Tools are not romance, but they lengthen the horizon on which romance can exist. I inventory what didn't happen. No late-night hands at my doorknobs. No surprise, urgent calls from a banker who already spoke to someone pretending to be me. No text insisting that a family emergency needs my signature to become noble. I do not say, thank God, the way I used to. I say good policy, and mean the same thing with fewer appeals to luck. And then I inventory what did happen, as if to prove that boundaries don't erase life. They make it legible. Sunday calls at 5, Friday budgets in 2 pages, honest and sometimes ugly. Counseling receipts with ink that smudges where a thumb pressed too hard at the counter. A prenatal copay paid by the tracked account we set up. Not from an envelope, not from a glove compartment, not from a favor I'll be billed for later. Neighbors borrowing my drill and returning bread week after week, the ledger never quite balancing and no one minding. I used to believe love required flexibility so complete it looked like dissolving. Now I think love requires edges. Without them, affection becomes leverage. With them, affection becomes help. The sentence is short enough to memorize. Love without boundaries turns into pressure. Love with boundaries turns into care. Guilt took longer to rename. There are years I missed because a project went long or an airport shut down under weather that only existed on a radar screen. In the old script, I owed for those absences forever. In the new script, guilt isn't a foreman. It's a punch list. A checklist corrects what can be corrected. Apologies spoken, stipends routed, time given, and leaves the rest to the clock. A bad foreman keeps men on the ladder after the daylight's gone. A good supervisor calls the job for darkness and brings everyone back in the morning. Daniel keeps showing up in his budgets, in his counseling sessions, in the way he talks about his days as if he were finally the author. He still sends me screenshots to prove the meetings are real, and I still pay the stipend when the documentation clears. He's learned that the money has teeth and that the teeth exist to save his ankle, not bite it. When he asked if I would consider guardianship if something happens, I answered the way we answer everything now. On rails. I will after a year of documented counseling and financial literacy. Then we sign. He didn't argue. He said he understood, and what I heard in the space after the words was a grown man accepting a rule because it protects what he says he loves. Alyssa keeps her distance and her civility. Appointment confirmations arrive on time. No attempts at the locks. No new stories spun for public consumption. We are, for now, 2 adults who share a future without sharing a front door or a bank account. Peace is sometimes the shape of 2 circles that only overlap where they must. The HOA policy has gone from controversy to routine. Quarterly, a PDF lands in my inbox listing serial numbers, issue dates, and acknowledgments. The retired IT auditor's sentence from the meeting has grafted itself to my thinking. This is an audit trail problem, not a feelings problem. It applies to remotes and to families and to hearts that want to be kind without being naive. A line from months ago returns to me at odd moments. I won't buy peace with a signature I'll regret. I broaden it when I hear it now. I won't buy love, safety, or belonging with the very things that keep me able to love, protect, and belong. The house is not only a structure, it is the visible side of a choice to remain useful, solvent, and present. If a man my age asked me for a kit, I could hand it over in one page. Will, trust addendum, healthcare proxy, passphrases, account locks, camera and lock hygiene, written only money talk, a budget he can read without squinting, a rule that no transfer, gift, or promise moves unless it can sit in writing on a desk without making the room hot. Neighbors, too. 3 you can call for soup or a ladder, that's the kit. None of it will make anyone love you. All of it will keep you ready to say yes when yes is right. I don't close the door on affection. I keep it on hinges that don't squeal. When that child arrives, if life gives me the privilege, I intend to be the kind of grandparent who says yes to the right asks, school pickups, pancakes at dawn, a steady seat at the winter concert, because I kept saying no to the wrong ones. I will teach small hands how to sand a kayak rail and tell them why we oil wood and why we don't sign blank papers. A neighbor said once on my porch, "Feels like this house was waiting for you." Maybe, or maybe I was waiting for a place that required me to become the man who could live here well. Either way, I use the phrase that has carried me through this. Don't close your heart. Change the locks. It isn't a slogan. It is a method. You keep the door to love open by keeping the path to harm closed. I file the week's receipts, run the backup, and lay a palm on the firebox lid to feel the heat of the ordinary. Outside, the porch string lights take their shift as the sky goes to ink. Far off, a fairy horn stitches shore to shore. I breathe with the house. The house holds. And tomorrow, when the locks tick green, we begin again on purpose, within edges, with room enough for joy. There is a kind of peace that isn't loud or showy. It doesn't arrive with applause or grand gestures. It takes shape quietly, the way a house learns the rhythm of its occupants and a shoreline learns the rhythm of the tide. In that quiet, we discover that safety and tenderness are not opposites. They are partners. Boundaries are how we keep them married, clear lines that protect what matters so love can stretch without tearing. The lesson is simple to say and hard to practice. Love needs edges. Without them, care turns into pressure, generosity into obligation, hope into a bargain. With them, the everyday things, meals shared, calls returned, promises kept, begin to add up to something durable. Security isn't suspicion, it's stewardship. It's the choice to design a life that can hold both affection and accountability at the same time. That design is practical. It looks like paperwork that spares guesswork, systems that resist panic, and the habit of writing down what will be easy to argue about later. It looks like saying no so that the future has room for better yes. It means expecting adults to act like adults while leaving the door open for grace when they do. Preparedness is not paranoia. It's a way of honoring the people you love by refusing to gamble with the things that keep you useful to them. Peace also grows in community. The right neighbors, the right table, the right routines create a scaffolding stronger than any one person's willpower. We learn to trade small kindnesses without keeping score, and we remember that stability isn't found. It's built, one honest week at a time. The loudest proof is often what doesn't happen. No midnight dramas, no performative urgency, no decisions made under heat, just ordinary days that fit together and make a life. There is room here, too, for forgiveness that doesn't forget. We can choose to stop rehearsing old injuries and start rehearsing good habits. We can give help that comes with a handle, conditions that dignify everyone involved. We can welcome new life and new chances, not because we surrendered our edges, but because we kept them. When care lives inside structure, trust grows back, not overnight, and not perfectly, but enough. If this story leaves anything behind, let it be a simple method. Treat your heart as something worth protecting, your word as something worth documenting, and your home, whatever that means to you, as a promise you intend to keep. Don't close your heart. Keep it open on purpose. Change what needs changing so love can come and go by the front door in daylight with receipts. Thank you for spending part of your day here. If a line or idea met you in the right moment, tell us about it. What lesson are you taking forward? Where did you feel seen or challenged or relieved? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Your perspective may be the exact encouragement someone else needs tonight. And if reflections like these help you navigate the complicated mix of love, boundaries, and second chances, please subscribe and turn on notifications to stay connected to future stories and conversations. Before you go, one more invitation. Add a time-stamped note about the moment that stayed with you so others can find it too. Share this with a friend who could use a gentle reminder that safety and compassion can live in the same room. Revisit this whenever you need a nudge toward steadier choices. We'll be here next time, building a little more peace, one clear choice at a time.